Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Liturgy of the Chalice. This is the Gospel of Mark, part 29 of a series. So now we are getting to the point where Jesus is put on trial before the Sanhedrin, or the upper aristocracy of the temple establishment, the chief priests, the scribes, etc. So Mark 14:53 through 61, it reads, "They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none, for many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.' But even on this point, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?' But he was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' So this is very interesting because in our last session, we saw Jesus being arrested, and now we're seeing his trial, his scourging, his abuse by different people that were around this time before he was crucified. So here they're trying to find some reason to put Jesus to death. What we have to realize is that Jesus taught something very powerful, very innovative, and very different from what the temple establishment priesthood was teaching. Basically, the priesthood said, you need us. You need us to relieve you of your sins, much like the contemporary Roman Catholic Church does with their priesthood. You need to be forgiven by a priest in order to be purified, in order to be sanctified, in order to be made right with God, to become righteous, so to speak. And Jesus taught a path of the heart. He taught a way of independent purification, independent spiritualization of the mind, our words, and our deeds. He said that we can do this with God, by ourselves, and with other people that are like-minded. So Jesus wasn't against worshiping God in a group. Obviously, he did that at different table seders, which is the forerunner to the Eucharist that we practice today, here and now. But the real work is internal. There are so many symbols that we can't discuss right now that rest on this beautiful altar behind me as I give this chalice talk. There's so many deep meanings in all of Jesus's teachings that are lost upon the ears and hearts of many modern Orthodox Christians. If Jesus were to preach his message in a Catholic church or in an evangelical church, they'd probably kill him too, because the teachings of Christianity do not match the teachings of the Jesus of history, the Master Jesus, Mar Yeshua. They were quite different. They were quite revolutionary then, and they're quite revolutionary now. So because Jesus's teachings were different, were revolutionary, it was a revolutionary renewal of the covenant with God that the Master Jesus, a great prophet and sage, advocated for. He even advocated for a different kind of Messiah than was expected in Jerusalem, where he was tried and arrested and scourged, and very nearby where he was crucified. Jesus represented a disruption in the way that things were. And they needed to find a way to get rid of him because Jesus drew a lot of attention to himself and made a lot of people question the way that things were. And when that happens, the person has to be eliminated. Nowadays, people will just, say nasty stuff on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or wherever. But back then, it was much more serious. Back then, it could be death if you disagreed with the powers that be. And Jesus was at odds with the Pharisees and the Sadducees that ran the second temple of Jerusalem. He was at odds with the high priest, the chief priests, the elders, the scribes. And they wanted to get rid of that dissonance, that voice that had a different story to tell from what they understood and practiced. Of course, Jesus has said in the Christian Testament, destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. Here you see that there's a distortion in that popular teaching of Jesus, of what he was said to have said. Of course, whenever he said, "I will," if you destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it in 3 days," he was referring to himself. Of course, it's a little bit distorted, and we'll talk about that more in the weeks to come. Resurrection was always a mystical, spiritual resurrection of a spiritual body, and Paul teaches that in 1 Corinthians, as we'll see in the weeks to come. And of course, we've talked about it in other talks too. Jesus did not raise physically from the dead. That's evident in the epistles of Paul, which again we'll cover on Easter morning in just 2 weeks, I believe it is. So he rose in a spiritual body, in a mystical body, in a chema body. So he did not rise in a physical body. So one way you could take it, destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days, is that if you destroy this physical body, I will rise in a spiritual body, so much more powerful. And I will appear in visions to all of my disciples, showing that there is death beyond this existence. Of course, modern church orthodoxy has twisted this teaching of Jesus, just as the Sanhedrin twisted it here in Mark 14:53 through 61. In modern day churches, they say that Jesus is referring, when he says, destroy this temple, and I will raise it in 3 days, they're saying that if he was crucified, he'll raise his physical body from the dead. And that's not true, just based off of the 1 Corinthians. Reading 1 Corinthians and understanding what Paul said resurrection was, Paul did not believe in a physical rising from the dead. Some Jews did. Some Jews today still believe in physical resurrection. Some Jews believe in mystical resurrection of a spiritual body, like Paul did. And some Jews today and in the past don't believe in resurrection at all. So there's a wide variety of viewpoints on what resurrection was, and if indeed it was real or not. According to St. Paul in the epistles, particularly 1 Corinthians, there was no physical resurrection. It was a spiritual resurrection that was to happen. So if Jesus did say, destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days, he meant that if his physical body was destroyed, he would raise up a more powerful spiritual body, capable of communication with his disciples, not only for 40 days after the resurrection event, but for all time. Jesus is ever living, he's ever conscious. And for those that meditate and do his teachings and really want to have a deep personal relationship with him, he can still speak to us today. He can still appear to us today. It depends on the intensity of your calling in prayer and the depth of your meditation. But just as the story of Jesus' resurrection is twisted today, it was twisted then. Notice how different they said it. false testimony. They said they heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands. So here they're trying to twist it to make it seem like Jesus was saying he would destroy the second temple, or some way create an uprising in Jerusalem that would desecrate or destroy the temple. And that somehow magically in 3 days he would build another one, when it took a long time to build the second temple. But all these different testimonies didn't agree. So finally, the high priest is very frustrated because they still don't have him on anything. And he said, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? It's really interesting. It's really interesting because I see, whenever I read, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? You could read this in different ways. Remember that the chief priest was in Jerusalem, and the main messianic expectation in Jerusalem at the time was the Davidic Messiah. So he said, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? So he's asking, are you the Messiah ben David, the King of the Jews, the Son of the Blessed One? The Blessed One is most likely interpreted to be God, Abba, the Father, Mother, God. But also it could also be interpreted as, are you the Davidic Messiah, the son of King David, the Blessed One of Yahweh? What did Jesus answer? Mark 14, 62 through 65, it reads, Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, prophecy. The guards also took him over and beat him. So it's very interesting. If I were to go back to this slide, they ask, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? They obviously were interpreting this from the temple establishment side. They were asking him if he is the Davidic Messiah, the Son of God. The Son of God being a perfected sage, a perfected Jewish master, was called or given the honorary title of Son of God, Son of the Blessed One. And Jesus said, I am the Messiah. But then he defines Messiah. And they, as well as all modern Orthodox Christians, miss what Jesus is saying here. Jesus says, I am the Messiah. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. He says he's the Messiah, but he does not say he's the Davidic Messiah. In fact, earlier in Mark, Jesus rejects the concept of a Davidic Messiah. Jesus did not accept the idea of the Davidic Messiah. He did not self-identify as the Davidic Messiah. But he said, I am Messiah, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. The Son of Man is called the Baranash in Aramaic, and that means the Son of Mankind. This Son of Man is well known in Jewish sources as being a collective communion of saints. It is a collective Messiah. It is a corporate Messiah, if you wish. All beings that spiritualize and embody the Torah in thought, word, and deed, and subsequently embody not only Torah understanding, but the teachings of Jesus those who embody that in thought, word, and deed experience second birth, spiritual rebirth. And that rebirth is from the first Adam. The first Adam is a selfish, unspiritual humanity that often falls from God's grace. But when you spiritualize yourself and transform yourself on a soul level, on a heart level, then you become eligible to enter the communion of saints. You become anointed as a great saint, a perfected being, part of the Son of Mankind collective Messiah, which is known as the Barnash. So Jesus did not teach that one Messiah would come to save all people, which was an expectation of Judean Pharisees in Jerusalem. Jesus taught this Son of Mankind Messiah, this collective Messiah, which Paul refers to as the second Adam, the second or new humanity, a spiritualized humanity, a compassionate humanity, a spiritually empowered humanity, empowered by God's sovereignty. And here Jesus quotes the book of Daniel. And also it quotes, he's directly quoting Daniel, but this is also alluded to in the book of Enoch, in the intertestamental literature. So when you understand Daniel properly, and when you understand Enoch properly, then you understand that the Son of Man is not the same thing as the Davidic Messiah. It's very clear. And we've had many presentations on that. The Son of Mankind is a communion of saints. Jesus was a Messiah, an individual Messiah. He could rightfully say, I am a Messiah. I am an anointed one, part of the anointed Son of Mankind collective Messiah. I'm a part of the whole that sits at the divine heavenly table of the Messianic banquet. And this Son of Mankind Messiah is coming with the clouds of heaven. Clouds are anonym, and these clouds in Judaic culture represent secrets, mysteries of God. So this communion of saints that are being born on earth, they understand all the mysteries of heaven, all the secrets of heaven. Whether the Jewish high priest understood what Jesus was saying as I'm teaching now, or not, he felt that it was blasphemy for anybody to claim to be a Messiah. So he executed him on this point, had him recommended to Pilate to be executed. And they began to spit on him and tell him to prophesy, and they beat him. They abused him. We have to understand that this probably isn't historical, at least as it's presented. And I'm not saying that Jesus wasn't tried on trial, that he wasn't abused. He was. But the high priest would have known that there were definitely different messianic expectations. He would have known what the Son of Man, the Barnash, was. And he would have known that it's different from the Davidic Messiah. So as the story is told here in the Gospel of Mark, it's not historical, because the Gospel of Mark and all of the canonical Gospels and all of the non-canonical Gospels that I know of seem to conflate the Davidic Messiah with the Son of Mankind collective Messiah. They don't understand them as two separate messianic expectations, like history understands it to be. So, although they put him to death, it wouldn't have been based off of this understanding that he claimed to be the Davidic Messiah, etc. It doesn't make sense with history. It's historical fiction. or just fiction. And when we come back here to Peter being outside, Peter couldn't be inside. If Peter was recognized as being Jesus's disciple, he would have been executed alongside Jesus. He would have been imprisoned, tortured, and executed right next to Jesus on another cross. So that's why Peter had to stay at a distance. We'll revisit this towards the end of our talk. So Peter denies Jesus. Mark 14, 66 through 72. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When he saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed, and the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. A lot of people ascribe to these verses here seen, Mark 14, 66 through 72, excuse me, they will ascribe cowardice to Peter. In our apostolic tradition, it is not taught that Peter was a coward. We have to think about this logically. Jesus warned all of his disciples to scatter. He warned them to leave him, to get far away from him. Why? Because they would have been executed too. He would have warned them, if they say that you were with me, deny it. Because if they say what they want to say in their hearts, yes, that's my master, that's my beloved spiritual master, my rabbi, my Rav, then they would have been arrested and killed too. And if Peter and all the other apostles would have been arrested, trying to protect him in an impossible situation, they would have all been arrested and destroyed too. And then we wouldn't know any of Jesus's stories, any of Jesus's teachings. Jesus died for something. He died to give us teachings that purify our hearts and our minds and our actions so that we can experience spiritual rebirth into the Barnash, the Son of Mankind collective Messiah. Jesus was willing to die to give us those teachings. But if all the other apostles wanted to try to protect him, which would have been futile, then all of those teachings would have been lost. So Jesus told all the disciples to scatter, as we learned in a prior presentation. And he would have also said that if they say that they saw you with me, deny it. Deny it fervently. And earlier in Mark, Peter says, "I'll never deny you." And Jesus said, before the cock crows 3 times, you'll deny me. But it wasn't that he was a coward, it was that he was instructed by Jesus to do so. And remembering that Jesus had predicted this, Peter broke down and cried because he loved Jesus very much. But Peter was not a coward. He was following the instructions of his master in order to preserve his master's teachings for all future generations up to today. So Jesus was then handed over to Pilate because the Jewish powers that be, the temple establishment and Herod, they didn't really have full power to execute Jesus. They wanted the Roman government and the governor, Pontius Pilate, to execute him. So they recommended Jesus to be executed to Pontius Pilate. And we learn this story in Mark 15, 1 through 15. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them. And after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. So here, this aspect in public may be historical. Of course, they wanted to definitely, what's the right word? Destroy Jesus's reputation. So Jesus himself had said right in the temple steps that there's no such thing as a Davidic Messiah. But yet, many people in Jerusalem following Jesus expected a Davidic Messiah. So there may have been rumors that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, despite the fact that he denied the existence or the logic of a Davidic Messiah in the Gospel of Mark itself. I believe in chapter 12, verses 35 through 37. So the main charge was that Jesus said that he was the king of the Jews, the Davidic Messiah. And Jesus never said that. People may have said that about him. They may have suspected that about him, but he never said that. And a Davidic Messiah could never be defeated. And here, for all outward purposes, Jesus was being defeated. He was arrested, abused, being ready to be crucified. So the chief priests claimed that Jesus claimed he was the Davidic Messiah. And they showed that he was defeated. Right here and now in these verses, Jesus was defeated. How could the Davidic Messiah be defeated? He couldn't be. He would destroy all of his enemies in a moment and reestablish, restore Israel, both politically and religiously. So the fact that he was even arrested would prove that he wasn't the Davidic Messiah. So they were claiming that he was lying and blasphemy, and that's why he should be destroyed. But Pilate saw that the chief priests were just jealous, that there was no basis for any of their accusations. So during the festival, that is the festival leading up to Passover, it was the custom of Pilate to release a prisoner to the Jews, whoever they wanted. And he said, do you want Barabbas, this convicted murderer, to be freed, or Jesus, this seemingly innocent man, to be freed? And according to the story, he suspected that everybody would want to release Jesus, in whom there was no evidence that he had done anything wrong. But the crowd, purportedly stirred up by the chief priests, said to crucify Jesus. So here it seems, if we are to believe this story as being historical, which it may be, the chief priests and some Jews were encouraging Pilate to crucify Jesus. Not all Jews, some Jews, led by the temple establishment. So, to be clear, who killed Jesus? The answer is the temple establishment and the Roman governance, led by Pontius Pilate, executed Jesus. Pilate didn't want any uprising. He didn't want any rebellion from the Jews. So he also scapegoated Jesus. He had the power to say no. According to the story, he didn't. So he is just as guilty in the death of Jesus as the temple establishment was. He was weak and afraid of the crowd. Jesus is scourged. Mark 15, 16 through 20. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him, and they began saluting him. Hail, King of the Jews! They struck his head with a reed, spat on him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. This is not historical. Did the Roman soldiers abuse prisoners that were to be executed? Probably they did. But tell me, who was there of Jesus's disciples to see this, to witness this? Didn't he tell Peter and all the others to scatter, to go far away to protect the teachings? There was nobody in that room to see him beat and to report it to anybody, to report it as a gospel. It simply didn't happen, and we'll discuss more about this in a moment. So, is there historical value to any of these stories? Ask yourselves, who was present at the Sanhedrin trial of Jesus in the middle of the night? Who was there when Jesus was beaten by the soldiers of Pilate? Perhaps there is validity to the story of Peter denying Jesus 3 times in the qualified manner that we just spoke of. Perhaps Pilate told the chief priests about Jesus' answer to him, "You say so." But would the chief priests have recorded that? It would go against them. Would Pilate have recorded the execution of 1 out of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the Roman Empire? Likely little, if any of this, is historical that we talked about today. But it was a developed story in the early Jesus traditions that were circulating. No disciple was present at any of these meetings of Jesus with the Sanhedrin, with Pilate, or the soldiers abusing him. I am not saying there was no trial with the chief priests or Pilate, Nor am I saying that prisoner abuse was not customary for Roman soldiers to do. I am saying there was no one present with Jesus to record what happened to him. So they made up a story in its place. It is historical fiction. The other Gospels greatly elaborate on the trials and abuse of Jesus as the Jesus traditions developed after the crucifixion event. Most of the Passion narrative, as it is called, was derived from Psalm 22 of the Hebrew Testament. Just open up your Bible, read Psalm 22, and you're going to see all the source information for creating this Passion narrative about Jesus. None of it is historical, or at least the vast majority of it is not historical, because nobody was there. Just think about it. Nobody was there during the Sanhedrin trial. Nobody heard what those chief priests said and did. Nobody was there when Pilate was talking to him in private. Nobody was there if Jesus was being beaten by soldiers. So how did they know this story to tell it? They didn't. So they used the Psalm 22 as a source text to develop the Passion narrative about Jesus. But this is at least 90% non-historical. It is a story told about Jesus based on Psalm 22 of the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew Testament. Let us continue with the Liturgy of the Chalice.